This is to the people of the United States of America. You realise that you are being seen by the rest of the world as no better than Russia, no better than China. You've threatened Canada, you've threatened Greenland, you have invaded Venezuela, you've starved Cuba, you've caused untold pain around the world. The Strait of Hormuz and the blocking of fuel supplies, oil supplies, has brought countries to their knees. And now your president is saying that he's going to make the Strait of Hormuz an American territory. Have you people lost touch with reality? Because whilstsoever he sits in that chair, the American people are responsible.
You just heard from Martin Bella, an Australian man whose criticism of America is going viral on Facebook because I think it's hitting a nerve. Because he is tying Trump's global terrorism directly to the American people. Rightfully so, might I add, because Trump wouldn't be doing the things that he's doing had the American people not voted to give him power in the first place. And as much as it pains me to say this as an American myself, our elected leaders are more or less a reflection of who we are as a country. And Trump really does epitomize American stupidity and narcissism. In the same way that our leaders like to pretend that the world revolves around our country, a lot of Americans feel like the world revolves around them. Everybody thinks they're the main character. We never consider the way that our actions affect other people because we've all been conditioned by our capitalist system to think that selfishness is actually a virtue. So, unsurprisingly, our shitty behavior has made us a pariah around the globe. And to Martin's point, the rest of the world really does view us in the same way that we view China and Russia. A plurality of Australians believe that Trump is actually a greater threat to global peace than Xi or Putin. And this poll was conducted in March of 2025, mind you, long before he invaded Iran and starved Cuba. And our neighbors share the same sentiment. 48% of Canadians believe that Trump is a greater threat to peace than Putin, according to a poll conducted in February. And side note, the demand for Canadian citizenship among Americans has exploded since Donald Trump took office because a lot of people view Trump's presidency as kind of the point of no return for the country. So a lot of Americans are trying to bail because they don't want to go down with the ship. But I can assure you that Canada and Australia, they're not outliers because a new Pew Research poll of people in 36 countries released in June found that more people have no confidence in Trump than any other world leader, including Netanyahu, Putin, and Xi. And if you look at the countries where confidence in Trump is the highest, it's authoritarian countries or countries with significant fascist movements, including Hungary, India, the Philippines, and Israel. And this will probably come as a shock to most Americans, but the perception of China is actually improving, in part because other countries view them as a more reliable trading partner, but also because they're defying the neoliberal death spiral of Western countries and actually improving conditions for their people. They have one of the highest rates of home ownership in the world, with more than 90% of their population owning their own homes. And just from a governance perspective, they actually punish corporate malfeasance. And by punish, I don't mean a slap on the wrist. Sometimes they put elites to death, as was the case with Yang Yulin, who took more than $300 million in bribes. Now, that's not to say that there aren't concerns when it comes to civil rights and civil liberties, including free speech. We have those concerns here too, by the way, but nobody can deny the fact that Chinese people are now experiencing what we once referred to colloquially as the American dream when it was happening here. And Chinese people now feel pity towards us in the same way that we once felt pity towards them. I say that because a common topic discussed on Chinese social media is just how cruel our for-profit healthcare system is. They have sympathy for us because they can't conceive that our government just lets us die if we don't have healthcare. And on top of that, another thing that they talk about on social media is the American death line, which refers to the grim reality that a majority of Americans are just one crisis away from abject poverty or homelessness. And I think that a lot of Americans still have a really antiquated view of China because of propaganda and also because of how much fear-mongering we're subjected to with regard to the threat of communism. But the media isn't telling us about how the communists are eating our lunch and beating us at our own capitalist game. Aren't they embarrassed by that? Like, I'm not the capitalist, they are, but yet the communists are beating us at capitalism. Make that make sense. Our government literally banned Chinese EVs because they're so much better and more affordable than American cars that US automakers wouldn't be able to compete with them on the free market. Isn't that crazy? Like, doesn't that say something about our system? China also has become a global leader in renewable technology, which we could have been dominant in if we hadn't elected fossil fuel funded Republicans who still pretend like climate change isn't real, even though we can see it happening before our very eyes. So our loss is China's gain. And you know what? Good for them, because we did this to ourselves. But it never occurred to us to learn from other countries because we've been conditioned to think that we're not only the best country in the world, we're the only country in existence. Hell, we're the center of the universe as far as we're concerned. The only thing that matters to us is us. So we would never bother to learn from other countries because that would require us to acknowledge their existence in the first place. And we sure as shit don't care about what people around the world think of us if we don't even acknowledge their existence. And to the extent that we do, we tell ourselves that they think that we're the best people ever and that we're the envy of the world when they're fucking laughing at us because we look like buffoons. But, you know, like it or not, regardless if we acknowledge it or not, we do have to share a planet with other human beings. And as Martin pointed out in his video, we're kind of despised for our shitty behavior. And he made a follow-up video explaining what we could do to actually improve our reputation around the world.
You guys need to get over your apathy. You need to get out there. You need to protest. You need to get others fired up with enthusiasm, and you need to vote. And who do you need to vote for? Not just people to change the government, but you need to change your system so that this abomination of democracy never occurs again. But it's not just apathy, is it? Some of you are struggling to put food to mouth to survive, and that is your system that caused it. It is not socialism to have universal health care. It is simply decency. Until you vote for people that are willing to tax the super rich for the sake of the poor bastards that can't get off the floor, you will always be subjugated. You are not free. It's up to you. The whole world is behind you. The decent world. And we need you to do it because we are suffering from what you have become. Change it, please.
So for our sake and for the sake of the world, we have to get our shit together because we're making our problems everyone else's problem. And that has to stop. That's really unfair. And to expand on what he said, decades and decades of neoliberalism has culminated in a level of income and wealth inequality that is worse than the Gilded Age. Americans continuously voted for politicians who told them that we have to shift the tax burden from rich people to the working class because if rich people made more money, that wealth would trickle down to them. And even though that never happened, Americans never bothered to question it, and they just continued to vote for politicians who told them that it would. It's fucking insane. And they enthusiastically voted for politicians who sold them this line of bullshit. Reaganomics became so popular that Democrats felt like they had to adopt neoliberalism too in order to compete. Bill Clinton governed like a Republican for all intents and purposes and shifted the entire Democratic Party to the right. The party establishment that we're all fighting today are relics of the Clinton era who believe that you have to be a diet Republican to even be electorally viable because they came to prominence in an era where you had to triangulate. You had to pretend to be a Republican who does capitalism better because, you know, the New Deal era was over and giving all the money that we have to rich people was the only way you could do governance. I mean, that's quintessential neoliberalism. But the problem is that even after decades of neoliberal governance, the American people never had a collective awakening. I mean, maybe that's starting to happen now since the DSA is finally on the rise, but for the most part, we haven't really questioned the system itself in a meaningful way until more recently. Instead of questioning the economic model that we've chosen, a lot of people just fell prey to fascist demagoguery, and they started to actually believe that things are bad because of immigrants and trans people. So we're kind of getting a firsthand lesson in how capitalism devolves into fascism, because in order to reinforce itself, the system has to find a scapegoat for all of the pain and suffering that it caused. Because if the masses began to wake up and realize that it's actually the system and the capitalist class who's really to blame, then, the people might finally target the system and not fall for the scapegoating. So the problem is that we're not only clueless about who's to blame, we've been conditioned to think that there's no alternative to capitalism because the establishment has spent years demonizing its main alternative, which is socialism or even social democracy. So when you have a population of desperate dumb fucks, it's not hard to understand why they were susceptible to fascism. But us falling into fascism, it's not happening in a vacuum. It's not just an American problem because, as Mark alluded to, the fascists that we've elected are doing what fascists always do, and that's causing shit around the world by maximizing power and wealth in a global conquest. That's exactly what Donald Trump is doing. So if we want to take Martin's advice, then we have to actually start voting for politicians who want to meaningfully address our material conditions. Otherwise, we're going to continue to be vulnerable to the threat of fascism, and thus we will remain a threat to international peace and stability, assuming that we maintain our status as a global hegemon, which is now in question thanks to Donald Trump's antics. Because if the rest of the world really does move away from the dollar as the world reserve currency, then we will lose our prominence like that. Now, not all hope is lost, because there does seem to be a collective awakening happening now, at least within the Democratic Party, where voters are finally choosing socialists over milquetoast neoliberals. But it shouldn't have had to have gotten this bad before socialism finally became viable, because most of the crises that we're experiencing right now, it predates Donald Trump. And we didn't have to elect an authoritarian fascist to find out that far-right policies lead to objectively worse outcomes. I mean, Trump really is the logical conclusion of GOP extremism, but he's not the architect of it. He's doing Project 2025, which they have long wanted. And, what I'm saying here about Republicans producing objectively worse outcomes by their policies, that's not me talking out of my ass. It's not mere conjecture. That's what the data shows. CNBC reports that the top 10 worst states to live in are all Republican-controlled states. That is not a coincidence. These states have a lower quality of life due to higher crime rates, worse air quality, less healthcare access, little to no worker protections, and a lack of civil rights protections. And think about why things are so bad in these red states. Crime is higher because they deny the scientific realization that crime is a socioeconomic issue. And if you don't have a social safety net to protect people from abject poverty, you're going to have a higher crime rate, because poverty is a root cause of crime. And if you're going to deregulate and let corporations pollute your state, of course, that's going to be detrimental to the health and well-being of the people that you represent. Now, that's not to say that blue states don't have their share of problems, because they absolutely do, but it's almost always because they're embracing some of the neoliberal policies that make Republican states so miserable to live in. Because in a late-stage capitalist system, you're expected to at least meet Republicans halfway in order to be considered reasonable or politically viable. And, you also have to kind of kowtow to corporate America if you want to avoid the wrath of the oligarchy. So that's why a lot of Democrats do that. And also because they're capitalists themselves who stand to benefit from the current system that we have. In fact, the red states with the worst outcomes are often lauded for being the most pro-business, even if they're the worst fucking places to live. Just listen to Laura Ingraham of Fox News talk about this.
Now, check out this recent list. 650 CEOs were polled, and they rated the best states in which to do business. The top 10, including Texas, Florida, Tennessee, Georgia, South Carolina, are Republican. They're run by Republicans, except Virginia, which is at number 10, and North Carolina, kind of a purple state, at number 5. So money and people, resources, are pouring into red states. So how do the socialists brush this off? Well, they do so either by ignoring it or distorting the data, or with a little help from their friends. This CNBC report just comes out. They listed the 10 worst states to live in for 2026. All the states on this list, okay, Trump won. Every state except Georgia in 2020. And the list included 4 of the top 10 states for business. How does that make any sense?
It makes perfect sense. If your governance philosophy necessitates that you prioritize profits over people, you're going to cultivate a state that is worse to live in. The wealth that these corporations generate by ravaging your state isn't going to trickle down to the people. That's a myth. Letting them destroy your environment and cutting welfare programs to finance more corporate subsidies is going to make your state a worse state to live in by design. CEOs might be thrilled. They are, according to that poll that she cited, but regular people are not going to be thrilled. But lucky for capitalists, Americans never think to blame the capitalist neoliberal policies for their pain and suffering. Instead, they blame black and brown people. And I love how Laura is insinuating that CNBC is some ally to socialists when they are the opposite. They're an ally to capital. And they're only talking about quality of life and taking that into account because conditions have gotten so poor for regular people in some states that it threatens capital, which makes sense because who's going to buy the things that capitalists want us to buy if everybody is so sick and poor? It's like capitalism is eating itself. But this is the problem. Even though Laura Ingraham is an actress, a lot of Americans really are as ignorant as she was pretending to be. And unfortunately, the rest of the world has to suffer for our self-inflicted misery. We elected a fascist who's ravaging the world because we thought that he'd bring down the cost of eggs a little bit or some shit. And now everybody else has to suffer. The people in Iran didn't get a vote. Now they have to suffer. The people in Cuba didn't get a vote. Now they have to suffer. The fishermen getting bombed indiscriminately by Donald Trump illegally, might I add, have to suffer, and they didn't get a vote. I think that's fucked up. This is why people hate us. But here's the thing. To Martin's point, we really do have a chance to turn things around. As much as the establishment bitches and moans about socialists, the truth is that they're throwing us a lifeline. They're pitching an actual alternative to late-stage capitalism. And the midterms are going to be a test of how much the American people are willing to change, whether or not we're too far gone, quite frankly. Because after 2 years of fascism and global terrorism, Americans are largely going to get a choice between doubling down on that or healthcare and a livable wage. In Michigan, for example, Dr. Abdul El-Sayed is offering voters Medicare for all, while the Republican Mike Rogers is offering voters fuck all. So Medicare for all versus fuck all. It's an easy choice, if you ask me. And actually, saying that he's offering them fuck all is too charitable because in actuality, he's offering more Trumpian policies that are going to make things worse. So a better analogy would be if I offered you $100 or a kick in the balls. You'd want to take the $100, right? Well, that's not the case for every American. They might be interested in the $100, but they're going to ask, well, who else is getting kicked in the balls? Are you going to kick immigrants and black people in the balls too? Because I'd get more pleasure watching them get kicked in the balls than I would from the $100 myself, even if it means I'm also going to get kicked in the balls. We have millions and millions of people who would happily cut off their noses to spite their own motherfucking faces in this country. But if Americans were so desperate that they literally voted for a fascist, one would think that since they're even more desperate now, they'd logically opt for the polar opposite of fascism, assuming that pendulum theory holds. But if they don't do that, if they don't vote for the alternative to fascism after experiencing it for 2 years themselves, then I think it's safe to say that we really are a lost cause. There's going to be no hope for us. That'll be the conclusion from everybody around the world watching because it'll demonstrate to them that we really are incapable of learning our lesson. And the best outcome for the rest of the world in that case is going to hope for our downfall, hope for our global influence to continue to wane, so that way we no longer pose a threat to international peace and stability. And also, the hope is going to be that, we destroy ourselves as quickly as possible to the point where we're incapacitated and can no longer pose a threat to the rest of humanity. That may sound like a bleak conclusion to us, but I don't think it's unreasonable for people around the world to have that take if we continue to fuck up the rest of the world and just ruin things for the rest of humanity. And look, I can't blame them for feeling this way. We're not the only country on earth, and the rest of the world shouldn't be held back because of the leaders that we elect. They have no say, and yet we keep doing things that negatively affect everybody else. So I sincerely appreciate people around the world rooting for those of us who aren't complete and utter dipshits, but I can't blame anybody who's less than charitable towards us because I don't know if I would have that much sympathy for a population of people that repeatedly decided to shoot itself in the dick and then brag about how smart and brave they are for shooting themselves in the dick.